Hello. So one of the biggest swaps and switches you can do when you have irritable bowel syndrome is to swap regular bread for sourdough bread. This, of course, is true unless you have a issue with gluten, such as those with celiac disease. Okay, so one of the biggest lessons I cover in virtually every single one of my initial consultations when I'm trying to explain why the low FODMAP diet looks gluten-free but it isn't, is because of two main players in this. One is soy sauce. It's low FODMAP, but it has gluten. And two is sourdough bread. So why does sourdough bread fit in the low FODMAP diet when most other wheat-containing, rye-containing, or barley-containing grains are kicked off or significantly lowered on the low FODMAP diet? Well, gluten, imagine this fist is gluten and this fist is FODMAPs. Gluten and FODMAPs tend to show up in the similar grains, wheat, barley, rye. So say this is wheat bread. We've got gluten, we've got FODMAPs, regular wheat bread. They show up in the same grains for some reason, we don't know why. So typically when we choose, say, grains that are gluten-free, say rice, quinoa, etc., we lower gluten, or it's gone, and then FODMAPs. Funny enough, most grains that are gluten-free are quite low FODMAP as well. So when we look at wheat bread again, here we've got regular wheat, and we've got the gluten in regular wheat, and we have FODMAPs in there too. When we look at sourdough bread, sourdough's natural lactobacilli and yeasts chew up these FODMAPs. They don't touch the gluten, they chew up FODMAPs, aka they ferment FODMAPs on your countertop. That's why long fermentation time in these traditional breads typically are digested better. So say you go to Europe and you had focaccia and for some reason it didn't hurt your tummy, well, it probably was sourdough. There's a lot of people making some sourdough over there in Europe. So this fermentation process, those lactobacilli natural yeasts, they chew up FODMAPs down to about 70%. So sourdough bread, in theory, is kind of sort of like 70% easier to digest because it's much lower in FODMAPs. Again, for those with IBS, not for those with gluten issues such as those with celiac disease, because the gluten is very much still there. So when we look at wheat bread that's fermented, easier to digest. So that is sourdough when it comes to wheat, barley, or rye. Anytime you ferment something, you're lowering FODMAPs, you're not touching gluten. And that's why with people with IBS, they don't have a problem with gluten, usually, unless, again, you've got the celiac disease at the same time, which definitely can happen. But most people, it's not gluten, it's the FODMAP. That's why we eat sourdough bread for IBS, lower FODMAPs, doesn't touch the gluten, it's delicious, and it's made with 3 ingredients. So let's get started. Part 1, the starter. All you need is flour and water. That's it. If you can measure a scant cup of flour and half a cup of water, stir it together in a jar, you can make sourdough starter. The next day, you throw away half and you do it again. Scant cup of flour, half a cup of water. The next day, you do it again, and you do that for 5 days in a row until you have a nice full strength sourdough starter. That's what mine looks like. So basically, it smells slightly yeasty, vinegary. It does not smell foul. If you start to smell something foul, start again. After you make your starter, you can keep it in the fridge. And every week, in a jar about this size, I only feed it a half a cup of flour. So we have starter. To make our sponge, which is step 2, you're gonna take 2 to 4 tablespoons of this delicious starter, put it into a bowl, small bowl, whatever. I like to put it in the same bowl I'm gonna make my dough because then it's less dishes. It's up to you. 2 to 4 tablespoons of your sourdough starter that you lovingly made over about a week. Or you can borrow some of mine, I don't know, DM me. If you live in North Van, give me some of my starter. And then you put, so the 2 to 4 tablespoons of your starter in a bowl with a 1/4 cup of flour and 2 tablespoons of water, splash, splash. I really don't even measure it. I just kind of go splash, splash with my sink. Stir it and then leave that on the countertop. And after 24 hours, you can see it gets bubbly, kind of smells a bit vinegary, a bit yeasty, but doesn't smell foul. It smells just like clean yeasty vinegary, if that makes sense at all. So that is your sponge. I leave it on the counter for 24 hours. Don't do any more than that. You can do it for 12 hours. It's really a personal preference, but I find 24 hours is sufficient to give me this nice, bubbly sponge. So step 1 was starter, step 2, sponge. Let's move on to step 3. The final step in making sourdough. And again, all we've been doing is measuring out flour and water, really, and stirring. Pretty easy. So for the actual dough and putting the dough together, we're adding one more ingredient to the mix, salt. So I have my handy food scale here. I'm going to show you what I'm going to put into this sponge, this bowl of sponge, to make the dough. We have 500 grams of flour. I'm going to take salt, and we need 10 grams of salt, so I just add it to the same one here. May seem like a lot, don't worry. Trust me, do use it, because sourdough bread without salt does not taste good. I've done that mistake before. 511, that's fine, whatever. So you have your sponge, and now we're going to dump in this flour and salt. 500 grams of flour, 10 grams of salt. And so those are our dry ingredients to sourdough. I'm going to put this food scale back here, and we need 375 grams of water. You can Google how much that is in cups. I forgot. I think it's like a cup and a half. A little over, but that is fine. And add that 375 grams of water to the flour and salt. Now, literally all I'm going to do is mix this up. Look how beautiful it is. And also the sun is coming out for us. It was very rainy today. Mix, 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 mix. It's going to look shaggy. It's going to look wet. It's going to look like not right. But don't worry, because after you mix this all together, mix, 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 you're going to let it sit on your counter. And every hour or so, sometimes I forget about it and leave it up for 2 hours, you come by, you give it a stir, and you plunk it back in the bowl. You're going to cover it with a lid in between these stirs. So after I stir up all this flour, salt, and water, I'm going to put a lid on it. In an hour or two, I'm going to come back. Oh, my rice is ready. I'm going to come back and I'm going to give it a stir, a stretch, a pull, plunk it back in the bowl. And then after probably all the way to tonight, I'm probably going to pop it in the fridge. And you don't have to pop it in the fridge. You can bake it off at night. Okay, we have our circular piece of parchment paper, and I'm going to heavily coat it in flour. Now you can see that I've taken the dough out, floured the dough, and pulled and twisted it and manipulated it into this nice little round ball. And now I'm going to take this super sharp blade and, excuse my kids in the background, and then we're going to score it until it has a nice shape to release all that steam, so you get a really pretty pattern on the top too, and the steam has a place to go. And the end result is a beautiful, crusty, traditional loaf.